Doug is a young man who just graduated from high school and is getting ready to enter college. Before that, Doug got the chance to go on vacation with his parents to their hometown, located by a beautiful lake. When they arrived, Doug felt excited, especially because he knew there would be plenty of opportunities to have fun. With his best friend Carson, Doug planned to spend his time working at a diner near the lake. His goal? Of course, to meet the pretty girls who often hung around the area. However, the vibe around the lake was different from what they were used to. Nearby, there was a big house by the lake, owned by a wealthy man and his young wife, Lena. From the moment Doug first saw Lena, he couldn't take his eyes off her. She had this strong charm, a slim and beautiful figure, long straight legs, and a gaze that could captivate anyone who looked at her. Lena's presence was impossible for Doug to ignore. One day, while at the villa, Doug overheard a conversation outside that piqued his curiosity. Without thinking twice, he opened the window and stared at what was happening. There, Doug saw Lena and her husband Elliot being shown around by a real estate agent. Doug couldn't hide his curiosity, especially seeing how beautiful Lena was, who also knowingly glanced in his direction. There was something that surprised Doug but also intrigued him. Later, Doug accidentally saw Lena again, this time outside the house while he was fixing his bike. Lena seemed to be paying extra attention to Doug with a gaze that was so alluring. Doug felt like the world stopped for a moment, completely mesmerized by her presence. Unexpectedly, Doug saw Lena once more after that. This time, she was at the lake with her husband, who turned out to be a wealthy tycoon. Doug, who loved sailing, became interested when his dad mentioned that Elliot had just bought a classic yacht that hadn't been repaired in a long time. Doug was offered the chance to help fix the yacht, which he gladly accepted. However, when Doug finally got to see the boat, he was shocked by its condition. Although it looked good on the outside, there were still many parts that needed fixing. And while Doug was inspecting the boat, Lena suddenly emerged from the water, radiating a charm Doug couldn't avoid. Lena, who seemed unaware of Doug's presence, gracefully walked toward the bathroom, leaving Doug stunned by the sight. After that, Elliot suddenly approached Doug. At that moment, Doug felt extremely awkward and, without realizing it, averted his gaze. A little nervously, Doug started explaining the condition of the yacht Elliot was having repaired. Elliot, who seemed relaxed, offered to pay Doug $20 an hour for fixing the boat. Doug was thrilled. This opportunity was too good to pass up. That night, Doug was lying in bed trying to sleep after a long day of work. But then he heard shouting coming from Lena's villa. Curious, Doug peeked outside and overheard Elliot and Lena arguing. However, it wasn't what Doug had expected. He felt a little sorry for Lena, though there was nothing he could do to help. Days went by and the yacht was almost fully repaired. Only a few minor fixes were left. Every time there was movement from Lena's villa, Doug couldn't help but peek through the window, especially if it meant catching a glimpse of Lena. Later, while Doug was fixing some engine components on the boat, he suddenly heard a scream from below. Doug quickly rushed out to see what was happening. It turned out to be Lena's scream, and she looked slightly panicked. She stood there, staring at a car with a worried expression. Doug soon realized that what had scared her wasn't something dangerous. It was just a tiny spider. Without hesitation, Doug quickly removed the spider, which wasn't even bigger than a fingernail. Lena, smiling, felt a little embarrassed, but also somewhat amused, looking at Doug with a different kind of gaze. Then the two of them got into the car, and at that moment, Lena's shirt slipped slightly off her shoulder without her noticing. Doug, of course, felt awkward, but couldn't ignore the moment. It seemed like a tension was starting to build between them. After spending hours with Carson at the diner, Doug got home a little after 10 p.m. When he arrived, he was surprised to see Lena again in front of his house. Lena told him that the front door was unlocked, but she didn't want to disturb Doug's parents, so she decided to wait for Doug to return and ask for his help. Doug, of course, didn't want to miss the chance to show off, so he quickly rushed to Lena's villa. At that moment, it started to rain, and Lena hurriedly asked Doug to break the villa's window with a rock. Without thinking twice, Doug went ahead and opened the front door of the villa. When they entered, Doug saw Lena standing there wearing a white dress that was completely soaked, and to his surprise, the dress had become transparent. Lena seemed calm and started talking about her husband, who hadn't come home that night because he was busy with the brewery. Lena revealed that her husband was always busy, and she felt lonely. Then, Lena offered to help Doug treat the cut he got from the broken glass. The atmosphere between them grew warmer, and soon, Doug, who was experiencing love for the first time, couldn't hold back anymore. Without hesitation, Doug moved closer to Lena. At first, he thought Lena might get angry, but instead, she asked him to come even closer. That night ended with the two of them sharing something more special in the kitchen, and the next morning, they woke up together. Lena lay beside Doug, curled up gently, like a flower in need of protection. It felt incredible, and Doug felt as though everything had changed in an instant. Carson, who sensed something was off, eventually figured out what had happened. He accidentally checked Doug's phone and found a call from Lena. Carson immediately realized, but Doug had promised Lena to keep it a secret, so Doug didn't tell Carson anything. A few days after that incident, Elliot was still staying at home. Doug really wanted to see Lena, but all he could do was exchange glances with her from his balcony. However, this only made things harder for Doug, who was starting to feel trapped in emotions he couldn't control. A week after the incident, Lena came to the yacht. She said she was checking on her husband's property, but as soon as she entered the cabin, she immediately told Doug to close the door. That was the beginning of a series of events that became increasingly hard to manage. The two of them were emotionally torn, but in the midst of the chaos, they grew bolder in expressing their feelings. Whenever Elliot and Lena went shopping, Doug and Lena always found a way to meet there. The back door of the store became their secret spot, where they shared moments only they knew about. One day, Doug noticed that Lena had a small tattoo on her ankle. It was half of a heart, and Lena told him it was a gift from her first love. With great care, Doug took a pen and drew the missing half of the tattoo on her ankle. It was a deeply romantic moment, as if the world belonged only to them. However, their secret didn't last long. The gardener who worked around the house started to get suspicious after seeing Doug and Lena together. Doug began to feel uneasy every time he ran into Elliot, but luckily, the gardener chose not to talk about what he had seen. Elliot himself had no idea what was going on behind his back. He was only focused on trying out the yacht that Doug had modified. That night, Doug received a call from Lena. Her voice sounded desperate, crying because Elliot had hit her again. Lena said she wanted a divorce, but the situation was complicated. Elliot's family was too powerful, and if they called the police, they could be in serious danger. Even Doug's family might get involved. So, reluctantly, Doug had to accept the situation for now, while promising himself that he would do something about it. One day, Doug came home from shopping with his dad and went to his room, only to find Lena hiding there. Her face was filled with fear, and she said it was an emergency. Lena begged Doug to meet her at the villa, and without hesitation, he agreed. Doug told her to escape through the window to keep herself safe. However, when Doug arrived at the villa that night, he didn't find Lena alone. Instead, Elliot's lifeless body was lying in the living room. Lena was panicked and explained that Elliot had rushed in, trying to hit her. In a moment of desperation, she was forced to kill him with a fire extinguisher to protect herself. Doug tried to call an ambulance, but Lena stopped him. If they called for help, she could end up in prison for murder, and Elliot's family wouldn't hesitate to take revenge. Doug felt anxious, but at the same time, he couldn't let the woman he loved be in danger. So, without much thought, he knew he had to do something to fix this situation. In his confusion, Doug started planning his next move. One thing was certain: he wouldn't let Lena fall into danger, even if it meant putting himself at greater risk. At that moment, Doug knew he had to stay calm and let everything appear normal. No one could find out what had really happened, especially since it was already 2 a.m. and he had just finished work. When he got home, Doug found Lena sitting with his parents. After a brief greeting, he decided to head upstairs and rest. But that night, they met again at the villa. Without saying much, they immediately started cleaning up any traces left in the room and carefully planned their next steps. Doug arrived at the harbor wearing Elliot's clothes, trying to avoid suspicion. However, he made enough noise to catch the attention of the security guard. The guard immediately called out Elliot's name and told him to check in before setting sail. Doug panicked for a moment, but he quickly followed Elliot's usual routine and lit a cigarette to calm himself. Once the cruise ship was far enough out at sea, Doug grabbed a pole and struck Elliot on the head. He didn't stop there. He used his cigarette to ignite the gasoline on the boat. By the time the Coast Guard found the vessel in the surrounding waters, Elliot was already gone. They could only identify the victim through the belongings left on board. But then sirens echoed from below Doug's house. The police had arrived to talk to Lena. They wanted to know what really happened that night. The local cops might not find much, but the insurance company's employees were a bigger threat. They knew exactly how to work with the police to uncover evidence. Not long after, Angie, an employee from the insurance company, arrived in town. She went straight to the police station to find out what had really happened. Her main goal was to ensure that Lena wouldn't receive the $10 million insurance claim, so she had to find any evidence that could point to Elliot's murder. The authorities quickly sealed off the villa for forensic examination, while Lena was asked to come in for questioning. She had a lawyer ready to defend her. But she continued telling her story honestly, hoping the police would soon uncover the cause of her husband's death. The autopsy report later revealed that something was off. It turned out that Elliot was drunk that night, but he had died from a brain hemorrhage before the fire burned his body. The estimated time of death didn't match the initial assumptions, which only confused the police further. Eventually, a security officer provided a new lead. Elliot had already been dead long before the boat was taken out to sea. Angie also discovered something suspicious at the villa. The basement window was shattered, and there was blood on the glass, indicating that someone must have entered the villa on the night of the murder. Angie then started investigating the surrounding area, and Doug's family didn't escape her attention. Even though they didn't find direct evidence linking Doug to Elliot's death, the police began noticing inconsistencies in his mother's statements. She claimed that a masked man had been stalking and harassing Elliot for some time. Maybe that person was responsible for Elliot's death. This made Doug feel like something was off. Not long after, Lena sent him a message, asking him to meet at the cruise ship lodge by the river. Doug rushed there, wanting to ask why they were making everything so complicated, as if there was no way out. Lena calmly assured him that there was no need to worry because all the evidence had been wiped clean. There was nothing left to find, and she planned to go into hiding for a few days, just in case Elliot's family sought revenge. Even though they were supposed to avoid contact, Doug couldn't bring himself to get rid of the cell phone Lena had given him. She suggested destroying it, but Doug felt it was the only way he could stay connected to her. So, he hid the phone beneath the cabin floor, hoping it wouldn't be discovered. Lena was touched by Doug's actions. In her heart, she fantasized about a future together, hoping this would all be over soon so they could live happily. However, everything started to change when Doug returned home and found Angie there with the police. Recently, the police had found blood on the shattered glass window, and now they were investigating whether it matched Doug's. Doug felt nervous, but he knew there was nothing he could do now. As he was being taken to the police station for questioning, the officer escorting him suddenly stopped to do some shopping. Angie seemed to know a lot about the case, though she was reluctant to say more. Her goal was clear. She wanted to make sure Lena didn't get the $10 million insurance payout, and she believed Lena could get away with everything while others took the fall. Doug chose to stay silent and hide everything for love. But after Angie's reminder, he felt like something was off. He started realizing that maybe he had been helping Lena carry a burden that wasn't his to bear. Lena didn't seem to feel the same way, and Doug began to panic. He decided to meet Carson to talk about it. Carson was shocked but quickly realized that he needed to prove Doug and Lena's relationship was voluntary. Otherwise, Doug could face serious consequences. Doug remembered the gardener at the villa and the cell phone hidden beneath the floorboards, evidence that Lena didn't seem to be keeping any secrets from him. As they stepped outside, Carson sent Doug to meet the sheriff, the oldest man in town, who might know what to do in a situation like this. Before Doug could say much, his mother called, telling him to come home and not speak to anyone. It turned out his parents had found a pair of red underwear in his closet, and Doug had to go home immediately to deal with it. But things only got more complicated. When the sheriff returned to the police station, he received a report from Angie. The gardener had been found dead at a motel. When Doug got home, he immediately received a message from the sheriff, telling him to retrieve his cell phone as soon as possible or things would end badly. Doug quickly grabbed his bike and headed to the lake house. Angie, who had just arrived, saw him and immediately got into her car to follow him. But Doug was too late. The phone hidden under the floorboards was already gone, and that was when Lena suddenly appeared. Without thinking, they both gave in to the moment, kissing passionately despite the chaos surrounding them. At the same time, police sirens grew closer. Lena quickly took off her clothes and hugged Doug. Moments later, Doug was arrested. In his confusion, he begged the sheriff to help prove his innocence, hoping that his phone records with Lena could serve as evidence. The sheriff released Doug and gave him 20 minutes to take care of things before everything got worse. Shortly after, Doug decided to go to the motel where Lena was staying. There, he found several passports with different identities inside her backpack. Then, his eyes landed on the cell phone that had previously been used as evidence. That was when Angie arrived and Lena emerged from the bathroom, looking a bit uneasy. Doug pleaded with Angie to check the cell phone. Carefully, Angie opened the text messages and quickly realized that Doug was telling the truth. Without hesitation, she immediately called the police and asked them to send someone to the motel. Doug could only wait there, handcuffed, hoping the police would arrive soon to take him in. However, as he waited, Doug started feeling like something was off. Something didn't seem right, and when he took a closer look, he realized that the tattoo on Angie's calf was strikingly similar to Lena's. That made him even more suspicious. He quickly reached for the phone to call the police, only to discover that the phone line wasn't connected. That convinced him he had been set up. Before Doug could do anything, Lena's car pulled up in front of the motel. As she stepped out, she simply placed her cell phone on the car's armrest and gave Doug a meaningful look. She didn't say a single word, just that look, which left Doug even more confused, feeling like something much bigger was happening than he had ever imagined.